these technologies are going to become commodity. And so the way we could imagine shaping the future, there's more power available to us as the years unroll.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Chats. My name is Ray Abruzzi, the Senior Director for AI Product Management. And today we're going to be talking about choosing, training, and using AI models with Ian Mulvany. Ian is the Chief Technology Officer at the BMJ Group. Welcome, Ian.
Thank you very much, Ray. It's a real pleasure to be here today.
How do you think organizations, researchers, the BMJ Group, publishers like Wiley, how do you think we should be thinking about AI tools today?
We are an industry that creates knowledge, and much of that knowledge creation, like that value chain from reading, writing, researching, collaborating on documents, refining your documents, writing the code, writing the paper, having it published, all the way through to the dissemination, understanding who's interacting with that. Every step of that piece of the value chain is heavily connected to text or a text process. And even though those processes are, functionally not the thinking itself, they're very deeply connected to the creation of that knowledge. And what we've seen with these tools over the last couple of years, particularly since the launch of ChatGPT, is these are now a new class of technology that can work with text and other forms of information in a way that we've never had before. And so just even stepping back on that point, there's almost no point in the value chain where you might not imagine that these tools could have an impact. And when a technology like that comes along, for an industry like ours, I think we all have to pay attention to that very seriously and try to understand what the impacts of that might be, what the risks of that might be, what the opportunities of that might be. Is that what you're seeing as well with your colleagues, with the people you're talking to?
Well, I think you touched on a few things there, and I think it's important that knowledge creation remains at the fore of what publishers do. When I began this role at Wiley, I quickly settled on the idea that our content is our AI product, right? We're a content producer. We've been doing so for 2 centuries, and that maintaining the veracity, the editorial control of our content and producing authoritative, credible, evidence-supported content is going to be key in this new ecosystem of AI tools. So
Yeah.
when I think about what Wiley's been doing or what other publishers have been doing, I think it's less about developing tools so much as making sure that fact-based content is represented and also not disintermediated too much by AI.
Yeah.
And by that, I mean
I
maybe the call for citations and sources and explanations of where content comes from.
I couldn't agree more.
What do most people, including myself, get wrong about AI tools?
Probably the very first misconception that I saw when I noticed people using these tools was treating them like search engines. And so the way I like to talk about that is I think that there's a difference between how we might describe what the tools know, what's embedded in their training data, versus what the tools can do. And so you can have a tool and you can equip it with access to other sources and other assets and resources. So if you're working with a tool in a way where it's doing a search on a literature database, then you can be pretty certain that the results that are coming back are going to be reliable and robust. But if you're depending on, I'm just asking the raw power of the LLM itself for what it may know, and you think it's acting like a search engine, that's going to bring you into a lot of trouble. And so getting a sense of what is the data the thing's been trained on and what might it know compared to what its capabilities are and what it can do, I think trying to get our heads around those differences is really important.
Well, I think that's a good place to start, right? So on
Yeah.
July 10th, I think the EU finalized its code of practice for AI for these large LLMs, and one of the foundational aspects of that code is that they explain and provide transparency into what's inside the LLM, right? So it's I think the major tenets are around transparency, documentation, safety, and security, right? And then there's some call to mitigate some of those risks. But till that goes into effect, it's been kind of a black box, right? You don't really know what you're searching against, and these these web-based chat engines or application-based chat engines. So the results you're getting, without links, without citations, for the researchers, I think that poses an obstacle, right? I can't say the AI told me so, or that I got it on the internet and then
Yeah.
submit a report or a paper to BMJ, for example.
I mean, the biggest area where we're seeing people get into trouble with this today is in lawyers using these tools and coming up with like fake legal cases. And there's been documented of at least 160 examples of this happening over the last 2 years. But you know, but I don't know that those kinds of guardrails at a legislative point of view will be sufficient to allow us to deeply understand what's inside the models, because the models have been trained at massive scale, and that's the kind of stuff that they know. But I think the picture I like to try to explain to people is it's not like a lookup table. It's not a retrieval system in the same way that we would have had retrieval systems in the past. It's doing a statistical inference over patterns of language. And those patterns of language have embedded and encoded a kind of representation of a world model around us. And that world model is what gives these tools the ability to do things. Now, they're not thinking, but they've encapsulated at scale world models or pictures of the world based on all of the text that they can ingest across the whole of the internet in any corpus that they can get. And the structure of that internal picture and that kind of vector space, the way that they hook those statistical inferences together, is just at a scale that is beyond the ability for any single person to reason about, or beyond the ability for any legal system to be able to put guardrails around. So I think you need to develop different kinds of practices and understandings of what are the mechanisms that we have to bring to bear in working with these tools to be able to work with them.
How do users evaluate whether the model they're using is appropriate for the kind of query they're asking, or whether there are more reliable or less reliable sources to ask those questions?
So it's a great question. I'd like to take a moment to unpack that again in a couple of ways, if that's okay, Ray. So, on the question of hallucination, the I'm reminded of this scene from the Avengers movie where our heroes are defending the capital city, and Bruce Banner arrives, and Captain America says to Bruce Banner, "Hey, it might be time for you to get angry." And Bruce Banner turns around and goes, "It's my secret. I'm always angry," as he transforms into the Hulk.
Mm.
And we have this
I've
sense that
received this
sometimes
criticism in real life. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, yeah. And we have this sense that sometimes we say, "Oh, these tools hallucinate." They're hallucinating all the time. That's what they do all the time. It's just that sometimes their results don't look like they're hallucinating. So I think if you're worried about fidelity of information in terms of how you're working with these systems, there are patterns that you can apply that can improve the fidelity of the information that's coming through. So you have the raw.
Is that in prompts? Is that in elaborate on that a little bit? I'm going to follow.
There are a couple of now, I think, really well understood and quite different technical approaches that you can take to this. So the first part is you can have the raw model, and then you can decide with your partners or through a third party or through some tooling that you might bring in house to do some fine tuning on that model. And when you're fine tuning that model, you're creating hints to it about the kinds of answers that you think are more acceptable, and it will return better rates of response.
Is the sort of obligation on organizations internally to point researchers, to point publishers, to point authors, editors to tools that they feel are the ones that are most suited?
So I think this is an area where we have a lot of uncertainty, and there are lots of patterns of how you wire these tools together in that are still emerging and not yet really kind of mainstreamed yet. So I don't think that there's a specific way to answer that question right now, because let's just take, for example, vectors. You can get more precision by having larger vectors, but that might come at a lot more cost.
Yeah, that's right.
So it kind of depends on what the task is that you want to do. It's a contextual question here. And it also comes down to questions like, what's the risk of the thing getting the answer wrong? So if you're working in a domain where, let's say, you're trying to find drug discovery targets, there will be plenty of process that will happen later that will make that a safe project to mitigate the risk. But if you're working on a tool where you're going to be giving recommendations directly to a doctor, you get that wrong and you have immediate patient safety issues.
What can publishers like Wiley do to improve the reliability of AI tools?
You can also intercept the response from the LLM and check it against a well-known knowledge resource. And so we've got this sense that you can train the model to behave better, you can fix your prompts to get better outputs, but you can also be checking the outputs of the model and just not returning results that you know can be checked against another knowledge resource. And so what's actually really great about our industry is we are kind of enablers of very rich structured data sets. And so the ability to be able to do that is already within our reach, to not only be able to work with organizations that are training these things or applying them, but to combine that with really rich, grounded, validated data sets that can be constructed in a way that creates a much safer ecosystem for working with these tools.
How does a researcher know when to fact check an AI tool?
Well, you can architect. So if we're working with just off the shelf tools today, they're not, I think, where they will need to go to be really, really accurate players in this space. So I think organizations like ours have a real duty of care to try to get in the room to help work with those kinds of organizations to make their tools better in that way. But if you're in a more narrowly defined market or a more specific tool, or you're bringing tooling into one of your products, you can just engineer that in directly. And if the risk level is high, you should be checking every response.
Right, right. So there's a appropriate level of
It's
sort of
appropriate. Yeah.
guardrails for different content. Should AI tools have confidence levels akin to what we use in text recognition programs?
Yeah. So what I want to say about this, Ray, is we have not been doing science very long. We've been doing science probably since the middle of the 17th century. Now, in the history of humanity, that's not that long. And we have not been doing science in a web or online enabled way for very long either, maybe two generations of researchers. So we're sitting today having a conversation about a technology that has caught the imagination of the general public within the last 2 years. In the context of having only been doing science for a few hundred years, with literally hundreds of years ahead of us to go.
Mm.
And so
You're
we
very
can talk
optimistic.
about, yeah, I'm very optimistic. I'm very optimistic and I'm very excited. And I think the future is there for us to try and shape. And so I recognize the ability for us to sit in the room and direct the product strategies of OpenAI is probably quite limited today. But if you look at what happened with even technologies that helped us build things like web pages, in the 1990s, that was a highly specialized skill that was hidden from most people. Today, anybody can build a web page. If you look at what it takes to train, deploy, and run a model and bring it and integrate it into your product suite, that feels today like it's something which is highly specialized and behind some barriers. But invariably, these technologies are going to become commodity. And so the way we could imagine shaping the future, there's more power available to us as the years unroll. And so, I think we have to look at the opportunities today. We have to try and get good information into those information spaces. But I think we've got to open the door to having a little bit of thinking about the potential for what these things could mean for the kinds of industries we are and the kinds of missions that we serve in a
Yeah,
way.
and where we are on that time scale, that's interesting,
Yeah,
right? You can find any number of flat screen TVs on the sidewalk now going off to the bin, right?
yeah, exactly, exactly.
The comparison to using versus engaging with these tools and accepting that there's going to be some simplification that allows entree into the development world for non-hyper experts that are involved in this now. Ian, have we seen AI's true potential yet? That relates a little bit to the S curve you were talking about earlier, I think. Do you want to explain
Yeah.
that concept?
Sure. So this is an idea that I've seen explained by an analyst called Benedict Evans, and his insight was that when a new technology comes along, we often only think about it in the context of what we're doing today. But the way that it changes the world and the way the world ends up having been changed will often look very different at the end of that trajectory to the way we expected it would look at the beginning. And so he talks about it as a S curve because you come in at the bottom, some massive change happens, and then you bottom out at the end. And where you end up was very different from where you began. And his example is mobile phones. People thought that mobile phones were going to mean mobile weather or mobile documents, but they led to the creation of things like Airbnb or Uber. The fundamental change of having a computing device attached to every person on the planet fundamentally changed the kinds of experiences that we could create. And so today, when we're working with large language models, in terms of that value chain that I was talking to you about earlier, we're still mostly just replicating and aping the activities in that value chain. We're not yet really thinking about a radical change in the experience of knowledge creation. And so I'll just draw on some sort of threads that I'm seeing emerging that I think fall into the category of how people might be misthinking the potential here, or maybe areas where I think there's further opportunity for us to explore. And that's around this idea of what are the kinds of architectures of how these LLMs and agents could interact with us. And so I was reading yesterday this nice idea that you might have a scholar pattern where the agent goes off and does some deep research for you. You might have an analyst pattern where it's sitting with you, working through step by step, providing hints to how you get to the next step in a solution. Or you might have a facilitator pattern where instead of us having a two-way conversation here, maybe we'd have an LLM talking to us and plucking out ideas or bringing in threads that was outside of the window of context that we have in this conversation.
Right. So it's like a multi-agent conversation, but one of the agents is not a human, and one of the agents
Correct.
is a human.
Yeah. And those would be radically different types of experiences. But most of where we're seeing usage is just replicating the existing traditional workflow. And what the change will end up looking like is highly uncertain, but I suspect it will look quite different from the ways that we're thinking about their uses right now.
What are ensemble methods, and do they work? Could you explain a bit more about that?
So the we've talked about the hallucination aspect of these tools. I mean, they're statistical models. So you can have it do a task, but you get a better result if you just ask it to do the task a bunch of times and then average over the results. So that's the ensemble kind of approach. It's like dumb parallelization, but we often don't engineer that into our systems. And yet it's a really kind of low fidelity way of getting a better result.
Oh,
So
see,
that's kind of one way of doing it.
my system is to ask different people until I get the answer I want.
It's kind of like that, right? Yeah. Yeah. Although you've got to be careful with some of the, like, not working with a model that is too acquiescent to wanting to please you. So that's a risk.
That's the confidence I was talking about earlier, the sort of supplication, the supplicant model where they're just trying to make you happy. And I can see that sometimes. I've had an LLM explain to me how hard it's tried to answer my question.
Early in the discovery of how weird these were, I read the story of a software engineer who wanted it to write some code, and it kept just providing stubs, not the full code examples. And the engineer was like, I'm sure I can do this. So the engineer said to the LLM, please write out the entire code for me because I have no fingers and it is very difficult for me to type. And then the LLM did it, right?
So you guilted the
So
LLM into doing what you needed it to do.
yeah, and they are weird. They are kind of weird, and because they're based on human language, often having an emotional way of describing what you want can get you a better result because our language is an emotional space. And so there's a lot of weirdness that we're still trying to work through in terms of understanding how these models work or how to best interact with them.
Do emotional prompts get better results?
Yeah. Or just that sense that having a good mastery of language can help you get a better result in working with these tools. And before we kicked off this chat, Ray, I was telling you about having heard that in one publishing company, they had found that their editors were getting much better results than their engineers because their editors had a natural affinity for language and their engineers were being really terse in what they were asking. And that more expressiveness of request was leading to basically hitting more interesting areas of that kind of vector landscape that was inside the model and returning better results. And that's a little bit connected to the context engineering side, which is, you know, yeah, I mean, in this conversation we've talked about like misconceptions. I think one of the other really big misconceptions that people have is not quite understanding how much information you can put into a model before you get a result out. And this is what is sometimes called the context window. How much can you coherently ask of the model? And the frontier models today have context windows of, you know, about 1 million words that you can put in to get a result. You can put in a fairly chunky full code base. You can put in every article in a reasonably modern journal. You can provide an enormous amount of context. And what does that mean for how we think about the questions that we ask? I think it changes the nature of inquiry, and I don't think as humans we're quite set up to think in that way ourselves. So that's an area that I think is still untapped that could be explored a bit more.
Right. So I think part of what you're saying is that the researcher, the person with the prompt, needs to bring the weight of the content that's to bear on that question
Yeah.
if they feel might be absent, right? So I'm going to upload,
Mhm.
10 of my papers here. This is what I
Yeah.
want you to look at rather than generally, and
Yeah.
then, combine versus the sort of immediacy of what you're putting in there deliberately versus against the prefab of whatever content might be in there.
And again, an area that our understanding of how to work with these tools is still pretty emergent. And what we're seeing is even the frontier model creators, like Anthropic recently wrote a really great paper on how they built their deep research tool. They had to instruct some of the sub processes to actively pay attention to the research literature because the tools themselves wanted to just be lazy and only look at Reddit or Wikipedia. And so they were finding that they needed to actually give nudges in certain places to get better performance.
How can publishers like Wiley ensure that AI tools improve?
These little nuggets are just coming out. We have to keep sharing. We have to keep sharing and engaging in these conversations to help ourselves, our whole industry, understand this sort of jagged frontier of capability that we've suddenly landed on our laps.
Well, that ties into one of my last questions. I'm wondering is, should publishers think about working together to build AI tools? Do you see other avenues for publishers to either co-develop or engage with AI and AI tools that would be beneficial both to the publishers but also to the researchers at the other end?
So, yeah, I think there's large amounts of untapped potential. I think that access to subject matter experts is something that is really critical as we roll out and understand how to use these tools in different contexts. I think that one other misconception is we tend to work with these tools in a real time like way. So I will ask of this tool a thing that I want it to do now, but the tool is just software. So you could have it do that 10,000 times. You can trade off immediacy with parallelism, and you can think of architectures where you have multiple different types of agents coordinated in different ways. And so going from this feels a bit like a human that I'm interacting with, and so thinking about it as a human-like system to this is software at scale and therefore can be architected in a very radically different way, and it can take ambiguous input and can run multiple different modalities in parallel. There's a massive untapped opportunity there in shaping how these tools could work in our spaces.
I agree. Yeah, yeah. Please go ahead. You had a bit more.
But I just want to finish by saying, like, I'm wildly uncertain about how to do any of that. Like it's yeah. Uh, on the more prosaic side, I think there's still untapped potential in multimodal modal use of the tools. And so, if you're a publisher, are you making use of all of your image assets just on their own as an input type?
You can do some of that with an LLM, but at
Mhm.
the same time, some of it's reliant on finding the contract from 50 years ago. How can publishers fight against AI misinformation? So,
Yeah.
as publishers, what role do you think we can play to continue to support what we see as the value and importance of truth, both in terms of the information we provide, but also in the context around that information.
Yeah, well, we are in the business of creating and establishing claims about the world and supporting the creation of those claims. And that's remarkable. And it's not like one paper comes along and suddenly changes everything, but it's this accretion of the buildup of evidence over time. And the role we play in the social contract between researchers about where they make those claims is fundamental to the buildup of a body of knowledge that is the truth about the world. And so, where we have something that is so powerful and is attracting so much attention, and people are going there to get answers, I think we have a moral obligation to be engaging in how to help those systems operate with the best information possible, because we know that bad actors in the world are going to be using these tools. One of the things I really worry about is the persuasiveness of these tools and how you can spin them up to act as agents that can speak to people in order to try and fleece people of money or change their opinion about things. And that's happening. We know that's happening.
Right. Some of the same
And
ways
so,
you talked about getting good results, you can get bad results, right? You can do the
yeah,
inverse of the
yeah,
cure engine to get the poison engine.
that's right. In the very first hackathon that I went to about these tools, within 10 minutes, I had created a fake video of myself talking about something.
How
And
do I
I
know
had
I'm not
taken,
watching one now, Ian?
uh, I hope that my sweatiness is a good representation of the fact that if it were an LLM, I'd be making myself look more attractive. That's
Yeah,
my hope anyway. But
same.
we talked a bit earlier today about the caution that we know that people in our industries have, because we are cautious and we approach things cautiously. But what's the risk of us not engaging? It's entering a world where that kind of misinformation that you talked about dominates. And so maybe the bar isn't maybe the scholarly bar that we might have held ourselves to in other contexts. Maybe the bar is this just needs to be better than what a human would have done in the similar circumstance. Because I feel we have to engage. It's important for us to keep communicating with each other about what we're finding. And it's important for us to try and open the door to have conversations with the folks who are building these tools and systems to help them create better experiences for their customers and for the general public.
I like that. It's more than sort of verifying, publishing, and disseminating information. I think maybe publishers need to consider being actively engaged with these tools in a more proactive, voracious way, so that we can make sure that the right side of the light is represented inside these models.
I take my hat off to the work that Wiley is doing in this space. So the fact that you're investing in the tools and technologies to try and understand where those interfaces happen, and that you're open about what you're doing, that you're engaging in these kinds of chats around these topics, it's important for us to continue to make spaces where we can learn from each other. And that's why I'm particularly happy to be able to take part in this chat today.
Well, thank you. The way we think about that, I think, is that we want to shape AI rather than be shaped by it, which is something you said in just many words earlier. Ian, thank you so much for chatting with me today. I enjoyed our conversation, and I look forward to our next chat. Don't miss our next guest. Subscribe now.